Hello and welcome to Contra Mundum. I am your host, Susanna Eileen Martin, and today we have a fun guest with me. This is my friend Christian. You want to introduce yourself?
Hey, my name's Christian Meerdahl, and I'm a history major at Liberty University, and I'm here to talk about it, talk about history.
Yeah, so Christian's a big history buff, which is why we made friends pretty much in the beginning. And the point of the show, as you guys know, is that everyone is an expert about something. His expertise is in history. And so can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in history?
Well, first I want to say, I feel like the more I learn about history, the less of an expert I feel like, because it's just, there's so much of stuff going on. But I've sort of always been into history. Like, I don't remember like one thing where it just went boom and I was interested in it. But my grandma is a huge history buff. She is on all sorts of like museum committees and historical societies and stuff. So I would go on a lot of trips with her when I was younger to all these different things. So I would spend so much time in museums and libraries all over the place that that's sort of where it must have started, just picked it up there, and I've loved it ever since.
Okay, so you have an sort of interesting ethnic history. Can you tell us a little bit about where your parents come from?
My dad is, my family for generations now has lived on the same patch of land on my dad's side, but then my mom is 100% Norwegian, born and raised there, came over here, did missionary work in South America and stuff like that, but then by some miracle met my dad, and just pretty crazy story there.
Yeah, that story was pretty funny. But we're talking about history today, so we'll skip that for now. One thing I want to ask is, what is your favorite thing about studying history?
My favorite thing about studying history is probably like learning sort of like crazy connections between things. Like, you'll be studying something and realize, wait, that ties into this, or this goes with that. Sort of like when you study sort of history in a general sense, they'll be like, oh, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. But really, it's more like a spider web of all these things going on at once, because you always study like, oh, like World War I, like, oh, it was because of one little thing, Franz Ferdinand was shot. But really, it was like this whole elaborate thing that all culminated to that point, and then everything that diverged from that point, and it's just way more complicated than anybody would ever sort of think just right off the bat.
Yeah, I remember the thing that kind of got me into history, I'm a little bit of a history buff myself, was my grandpa gave me a book when I was a kid about Abraham Lincoln. And just reading about that was like, I know nothing. I know absolutely nothing. I thought I knew everything, and I was this, naive little third grader or whatever. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's different from what I thought. That's the opposite of what I thought about history.
I have to agree with that a little bit, because like when I was a lot younger, of course, like I would think of all the cool history, like the Titanic sinking and like the wars and like all this like sort of like singular events in history that I thought were cool. But then as time goes on, I'm kind of like super interested in like more small scale history. And I don't mean small scale on just like this in this country and stuff, but like local history or state history and stuff like that.
Yeah, for my at Liberty we have to do this thing called Christian service, and it's like a volunteer thing. And so for mine this year, I've been doing my it's called CSER. My CSER has been researching Confederate soldiers that lived in this area and then writing little bios about them. And it's been really interesting because I get to see the war through the eyes of these guys that just, some of them lived, some of them didn't. A lot more in my first batch died than the second batch. I only had like 3 or 4 that didn't make it this last time of 20. So it's really cool to get to see what happened through their eyes, because a lot of times they weren't, I didn't get to see the fighting, the battles or whatever, but I got to see the little stuff like this guy got sick on this day and he had to go spend months in the hospital, which is horrible. This guy died of freaking diarrhea. Oh. That was one of the guys I just finished yesterday, but this guy might have made it back to sire his child in time. I'm not sure. That was one of the weirder ones, but it's cool to get to see sort of the local history versus the big picture that we're sort of taught in school as a necessity. It's hard to go over your local history.
Yeah, and something about that, when you say the local history and you're talking about individual experiences and stuff like that, I think it's really cool. Like, it's a lot more now that I'm in college, and I'm doing a lot more sort of like the research where I can look at collections of letters and things like that. But just like a lot of the history that you learn is history seen through the eyes of presidents and kings and kaisers and generals and things like that, sort of like the big famous people. But then when you look at it, it's really cool to look at like how his history impacts the little guy, like a diary of a grocery store owner from Kansas or something like that in World War II, and just like the little things that affected the everyday lives of all these people, or letters from soldiers back home in the Civil War and stuff like that. It's kind of cool to see the individual side of history.
Yeah. Sometimes it's easy to see sort of the big scale of things, but you forget that this is happening to people. I mean, well, for instance, I just finished the last list. I had a list of names that I had to go down, and the last like 7 of them were the same with the same last name of Turner. And so I ended up having 4 of the same brothers, and 3 of them made it, but one of them didn't, and he was the youngest. And it was just like, oh, this is terrible. You can see like the individual impact when you go in and you look at what people actually go through.
For sure. And it's sort of I mean, for me, I kind of find it hard sometimes to compare like history in the past to history today, because it's really easy to fall into the sort of really political side of it where you just cherry pick from history and then turn it into whatever you want it to say. But to see like it's not that different from like today, when there's the individual stories of soldiers or individual stories now that tie into sort of the grander events. But I'm sure in the future, I mean, maybe not because of sort of our world of technology and so much information today, but a lot of that might just fall by the wayside in the future when they're studying it, because they're just going to look at the big things, the bigger events, and just forget all the stuff that was important to us at the time, just like it was important to people in the past at the time, a lot of times, the smaller stuff.
Yeah, it's really easy to sort of warp history to look at it from the past. And plus, when you go farther back, there's just, you don't know what happened. You can't tell what individual people saw. You kind of have to see it through the eyes of these big picture things. So speaking of the past, what specifically is your favorite time period of history?
That's
hard question, I know.
It is a tough one because it's pretty fluid. Like it's sort of like whatever I'm most interested at the time. So in general, American history, probably just basically from the founding to the present day, just sort of because it's, I don't know, it's personal, just because it's me, it's America sort of. But right now I'm really interested in like World War I, because it's sort of like the centennial is happening right now, and it's kind of overlooked because World War II that gets all the big play because Hitler. I mean not it well mainly Hitler. Deservedly so that World War II gets big play, but I think World War I is extremely important. Like, and I didn't realize until I started studying it because of the centennial and all this stuff, but it's like a real transition period from the 19th century. It's really like it's the transition into the 20th century. The way war works, the way diplomacy works, just like all this stuff, it changed everything, I'm willing to say. It's crazy learning about it when I just had very little idea other than trenches and Franz Ferdinand and like that's it. Like,
it's interesting to know that a bunch of the soldiers that I was researching ended up making it through into like the 1920s. And so that means that these poor guys survived the American Civil War and the First World War. I mean, they probably didn't fight in the First World War because, they were mostly 60 at the time. But it's interesting to see how close those time periods are. I would never have thought that those were so close together. It's you don't notice until you actually look at it. Like, we think of the time of pirates and like Pirates of the Caribbean era stuff as completely separate from the American Revolution, but really they were kind of happening at the same time, or the build up to it, both of them anyways.
Yeah, that's something else interesting about history is sort of when you study it in sort of like a high school like history class level type thing, you might not realize you might realize, but it's not really, at least for me, it wasn't really connected in my head that, oh shoot, like the sort of like things that coincide in history, because it's always sort of segregated. Like you learn about American history and then you learn about European history and then maybe you'll learn about world history, but it's not really like, it's sort of hard to teach it with like okay, this happened in France, and then you fly to the other side of the world, and then this happened in China, because it gets really confusing. But it's kind of crazy to think that all these things were sort of happening at the same time. Like for example, Oxford University it formed hundreds of years before the Aztec Empire even came into existence.
What? Really?
Yeah. Like,
how old is Oxford?
well, I don't think they know for sure, but they know there was people doing higher education stuff there in, like, I want to say like 1050.
Oh my god.
And it wasn't like a university until, like, they weren't like confirmed it's actually a college type university thing until later. But then the Aztec Empire didn't form until hundreds of years after that. It rose and fell within the time that Oxford University has been a thing.
Wow. That is absolutely amazing. Yeah, it's the things that you don't realize happen at the same time are super cool. So one of my favorite thing about history is learning stories, which is part of the reason that I enjoyed doing this project with the soldiers so much, because I got to see everyone's story. But you have a really interesting one that ties back into Norway. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What was that?
Well, my story took place in my mom's hometown of Rjukan, which is in Telemark in Norway, which is sort of up in the mountains, way north of Oslo and Kristiansand and stuff like that. And it's the story of the heavy water sabotage operations. And it was basically an operation carried out by British intelligence in cooperation with Norwegian commandos to destroy the heavy water production facilities in Rjukan. Now, heavy water is like it's water, except instead of hydrogen, it's deuterium, which is basically, I'm not going to pretend to understand the science of it, but it's a heavier form of water. And it's important because it acts as a sort of regulator in nuclear radioactive like experiments and stuff. So like today they use it in nuclear reactors in some places on Earth, but a big thing that it was used for in the past is refining material for nuclear weapons, for atomic bombs and things like that. Oh. And that's what the Germans were doing in Rjukan during World War II, was they were producing heavy water for their nuclear experiments.
So this was pre-atom bomb, like by a little while.
Yeah, this was pre-atom bomb. This is when this is like early 40s when Germany's still working on it and the United States is rushing towards it. So it's not entirely clear who's going to get it first, really.
That's really interesting. Was Russia a player at this point yet?
I'm afraid I don't know that exactly. I haven't looked into that too much, but I believe a lot of their information came from basically being stolen from the United States, because they were, yeah.
They had some decent spies. That's one thing I found really interesting is that, what's his face? The guy that gets the really bad rap, the senator from, that was the guy that's, McCarthy.
McCarthy,
he wasn't particularly wrong. I mean, people use his name in a bad way, but he really wasn't wrong.
Well, I'm not going to say too much of anything about him, mostly because I don't know. And
fair enough.
That's something I've learned, is if I don't know, probably shouldn't open my mouth too much about it. But
that's a good rule
to a point, he was correct, but it is a bit of there was a fair bit of scare tactics and just sort of fear that went into it that didn't really have any basis in a lot of his accusations.
Fella didn't have the best didn't have the best way of getting around his ideas. Back to the Norway thing. Could you tell us sort of what happened? What you said your grandfather was there, right?
Yes. My
give us the personal angle here.
Yeah, my grandfather, he was really young, so he wasn't terribly involved in the Norwegian resistance until right at the end of the war. But his brothers were all in different parts of Norway doing resistance. So a few of them had to flee into neutral Sweden over the mountains. They literally just got on their skis and went for it, just days straight with the Germans chasing and stuff like that.
Wow.
But yeah, one of my great uncles still is alive there, and he is, man, he must be 98, 99 now, I want to say.
Old.
But when I go over there, he doesn't speak a ton of English, but he was able to tell me some of these stories when I was there a few years ago. So a bit more of the sort of personal side, because one of the attempted sabotage operations is the British flew a bombing run over the valley, and it's kind of hard to describe this, but it's like how you would picture a fjord in Norway. It's very steep sides going down to a valley in the middle, so it's a pretty difficult bombing target because if you miss something, it's not like it's going to land right next to it or something. It's going to fall quite a long ways farther into the valley. So there was a lot of casualties in the town. I think very few bombs actually hit anywhere near the factory. So there are quite a few terrible stories about that, where some terrible stories from him that he didn't necessarily want to talk about them too much because I believe he lost friends in this particular bombing run.
That's
but my
understandable.
grandma, she lost her next door neighbor, her best friend, and she was only a little girl at the time,
Oh.
but she was from this town as well, and lost her best friend from next door basically to one of these bombing runs.
Oh wow, she got lucky, I guess. It kind of reminds me of my grandma was supposed to be in the World Trade Center on 9/11, and she was like in the building the first time they tried to send like a bomb at the basement or whatever, and she got like blown out the front doors.
Wow.
So she got lucky twice and managed to avoid getting killed at 9/11 and the first World Trade Center bombing. So
That was
it was really interesting.
I want to say, for the first one. I think it was either
Something
91
like
or
that.
93. I want to say
Yeah.
93.
But yeah, it's cool to see these sort of individual stories, what individual people have sort of gone through. Our society sort of focuses more on the collective today, so it's cool to get to look back through history through the eyes of just one person. It's one of the reasons I love documentaries, because you get to sort of go back and talk to these people who are actually there.
Yeah, just on the talking to the people that were actually there thing, just earlier this semester, I did an interview with a Vietnam War veteran who was part of the 41st Signal Battalion, so in charge of coding and decoding information coming from basically everywhere in Vietnam at the time. And then he told me that they got the information first before any of the higher ups even knew about it. It had to go through
Oh,
them.
wow.
So he was privy to a lot of information, not much of which he was willing to share with me, but
Understandable. I remember one of the coolest stories that my dad has. He's an occupational therapist, and he does like home health and stuff. So he goes out and visits people's houses. I live in Norfolk, Virginia, which is a ton of old military dudes that are still wandering around. And one of the coolest times that he got to experience was he had a guy who was, I think, an Air Force pilot, and a guy who was a Tuskegee Airman. Yeah, exactly. And they were talking, and he realized that like they knew each other, like they'd known each other, and so he got to reintroduce them, which is pretty awesome.
wow, that is
Yeah.
that's something I really want to say quick about if you're going to be doing any sort of interview thing. I mean, if you have the opportunity to talk to people who are there for important things in history, by all means, absolutely do it. Like, it's an amazing experience for me, like talking even to like my old neighbors that were at special events in my state's history is really cool, because like for me, I'm really into state history, particularly my state.
He's from North Dakota.
I'm from North Dakota. So yeah, and if you ask me what there is to do, and is that the one with Mount Rushmore? No, it's not the one with Mount Rushmore.
I was about to say, I'm not actually sure.
Yeah, that's the first
Is it
question
South Dakota?
I always get. But I think it's really interesting because, and I don't want to say it's entirely because it's sort of like really overlooked, but I'm just really interested in it. Not, and I almost want to say it's sort of because like if I'm not, nobody else will be, and I feel like I really have to rep my state. So like when I'm here,
someone has to.
yeah, for real. Man. But the thing I was going to say is, if you're interviewing somebody, be sure that it's like a lot of open-ended questions, because it's not an interrogation. The best thing is for you to have an open-ended question that will just get them talking. You don't need to input. You're not the one who has the crazy experiences here. So just open-ended questions, and if you can get them talking and telling stories and only adding when you like need a little bit of a catalyst to get it moving again, that's ideal, instead of going like, okay, so where were you? Okay, now what unit were you in? Like that sort of thing. It's pretty coarse So it's sort of best to
kind of cold. It's just
exactly. Like the interrogation thing that I was saying there.
one of the best things about talking to old people is that in most cases they will just kind of keep going on. And honestly, that's so cool to get to hear their experiences from a time that, like, I didn't have computers. I mean, I can't even imagine some stories that my grandma tells me. I have one grandma that was a telephone switcher person. She was one of like the switcher ladies.
Wait, your grandma was a switchboard operator?
Yeah, that's what
my
they're
Norwegian
called.
grandma was a switchboard operator.
Oh,
actually,
that's so cool.
She used to because she worked for the phone company, she'd be able to call my mom when she was on a missions trip in South America.
Oh, nice.
Except she switched it so that they didn't get charged for long distance calls. She would just like do whatever trick was necessary so that it would look like just a short distance call. But no, it was actually a long distance call that would just be like tons of money, but she would just talk for ages and ages and not get charged for it.
Oh wow! See, it's stories like that I love. It's the little individual touches that you're gonna get when you just let somebody kind of go for a little while. Yeah. Okay. So the last one I want to kind of talk about was something that you told me about like 2 years ago or something, which was about a Confederate sailor that was like the last shot of the Confederate War. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because this story is really funny, actually.
Yeah, this was... So Liberty University every year, they have a Civil War seminar. So they bring in experts from all over the United States to talk about a certain theme in the Civil War. Like this year it was the Western Theater, and I'm a worker for the history department. Well, I do my CSER for the history department, I should say. So I was working at the seminar, but my freshman year, I was just going because I thought it was cool. And I mean, that's sort of the joy of being here in Virginia for school is it's so close to a lot of history.
If you're a Civil War buff like I am, this is like heaven.
You can throw a rock and probably hit something that was
we're like
a big deal in the Civil War.
30 minutes from Appomattox, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, but this story here is about the CSS Shenandoah, and it's been a while, so I don't remember all the details here. But it was a ship that was being built in England, and if you know a bit about the Civil War, you'll know that there was a bit of a row between the U.S. and Britain over them building ships for the Confederates.
It's a little bit of a brouhaha.
Yeah, a little bit of a brouhaha, I was about to say. But this ship set sail not to the United States, but around the other side of the world. So they did a little bit of, I believe they captured a ship in the Indian Ocean, and they were in Melbourne in what is now Australia, but at the time was a British colony. And they picked up a crew there because they had a pretty scarce crew on the whole way from England. So I believe the story went something like they couldn't recruit because there was still a war going on and they couldn't provide munitions and blah blah for a belligerent party and stuff like that. So basically they said, "Oh no, we have 40 stowaways on the ship." Oh no! Except when they got out to sea, they registered them all into the service.
Oh my gosh,
is
that's
basically
so funny.
the idea, I think. But anyways, they made their way up the coast of East Asia up into the Aleutian Islands. So they were attacking whaling ships because whale oil at the time was still a very important commodity in many
Were they
senses.
American whaling ships?
Yes. Well, there were a few, I believe, that were on their way up. They might have gotten a few Japanese and maybe a Russian one here or there, but most of them were American ships. So this was going on for quite a while after the Civil War had ended, and eventually they worked their way down to the west coast of the United States because one of the people that they captured on a whaling ship said, "The war's over. Like, what? Confederate flag? Like, what's going on? The war's over." And then I believe the captain, as I probably would, said, "Yeah, right. Of course you'd say that. You're getting attacked and you're just making up some story about the war being over." No, the war was actually over.
Yeah.
So the last shot of the Civil War was fired off the Aleutian Islands in what is now Alaska at a whaling ship.
That's so crazy.
And the flag on that ship was the last Confederate flag, like formally surrendered to a Union officer, like a formal surrender sort of situation.
Wow, they must have been like, "Oh, well, this is awkward."
But oh my gosh, that's sort of like a really interesting thing about history, and I really love the sort of individual sort of funny stories, and I would consider that a pretty funny story. Like,
I think it's
like
pretty
a
funny
fun
too.
fact, interesting sort of tidbit. that it's sort of outside of the sort of, oh, the Army of the Tennessee and like the whole big chunk, the whole big meat and potatoes of the war. But then there's this little story of one ship that and it actually was the first Confederate ship to circumnavigate the globe, because it
Probably
eventually
the only
came back.
one.
I think it was the only one. Like, I can't think of another one, but I'm no Civil War expert. But just like a little thing like that really sticks out.
Yeah. So that's about all the time we have for today. I've really enjoyed having you, and hopefully next semester sometime, you can come back and we'll do another episode.
Oh yeah, I'd love
So
to do
learn
that.
some fun stuff and tell me more stories.
Yeah. And one quick thing on
Go ahead.
the heavy water thing, since like a lot of the stories I have of it are sort of from my mom and from my grandpa, or from my great uncle, I should say. There are a few pretty big profile movies and documentaries about this. There's one with Kirk Douglas called The Heroes of Telemark, and it was made in the 60s, and my grandpa is actually in the movie.
What? Where?
Well, there's a scene that takes place in a church, and it was his church. So he's just sitting in his pew, like the family pew, so you can see the back of his head for a little bit in it.
Wow, that's super cool. Do you have any documentaries to recommend to people? Anything you've interesting seen lately?
Shoot. That's a tough one. Well, there is a sort of documentary miniseries, again, about the heavy water sabotage story called, I want to say it's called The Heavy Water War, and it was just released on Netflix here a little bit ago, and I haven't gotten the chance to watch it because, finals week and papers and stuff, but I would say recommend it. I've heard very good stuff about that.
Is that not the one that's in Norwegian?
Okay, I have to admit it might be in Norwegian. I'm not sure yet because I haven't watched it, but Norwegian is a fun language to listen to, and there's subtitles, I'm sure. So
It's a documentary. The subtitles are to be expected.
Yeah, but in the way of documentaries, there is a series that I'm not sure where you'd be able to find it. I don't think it's on Netflix or anything, but it's called Battle 360, and it basically follows the Pacific Theater in World War II from there's a few main character, I'm going to call them character ships, because they follow the war in the context of a certain ship. And it's really cool, just these really cool CGI representations of the battles. And it really gives you a sense of sort of the tactical aspect of the war, while also giving you a really good sense of, while this was happening, that's happening over there at the same time, instead of just following the story of one ship and then starting at the beginning and then following that story again.
Okay, so Battle 360 and possibly the Heavy Water Wars, if we remember it. So enjoy your Norwegian, folks. So thank you so much for coming, and I will definitely have you back. And to all of the people who are listening at home, goodness.
Alone at home. Oh, no.
Alone at home. I'm sorry. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.